In the next few minutes. The first is to very briefly talk about the system of protection and then to go over the program of work for Committee 4. Just by way of introduction of myself, I'm from the United States. For nearly 33 years, I was a senior executive and senior advisor with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This summer, I accepted a very interesting opportunity and stepped out of the day-to-day grind of trying to figure out why a licensee had done something wrong and moved back into the research program, and I am now the technical executive for radiation and safety with the Electric Power Research Institute. So, we've put up the objectives a couple times, but just to remind ourselves, we're trying to avoid detrimental effects without unduly limiting the benefits associated with the use of radiation. That started, of course, in the earlier times with a rather simple definition. We didn't want what you see illustrated here to happen with radioactive materials and radiation. And that has progressively worked its way down to starting to look at some of the stochastic issues. Genetic issues came to the fore for a while, and various cancer issues. And now non-cancer issues and environmental issues start to become of more interest and concerns. The system of protection has three fundamental foundations, and we're going to be talking about some of these in other sessions that are here. But you have a whole series of social and ethical values and principles. I'm not going to go into the details of this. The last session of this symposium is in fact dedicated to the ethics in radiological protection. There are all of the different sciences and activities that provide the scientific information. And there is all of the experience. This is a very small list, and if you don't see your favorite event, it's not that I've been trying to exclude it. And in fact, I've been rather discriminatory in the sense that I spent most all of my life on the non-reactor side of the house, which is unfortunately where many more severe events, Guyana and other things have happened, large radiography sources, strontium-90 generators for thermoluminescence found in forests, all sorts of things that have caused significant havoc and confusion. All of this has to come together into the system of protection. That system, as you probably well know some of the components, but in fact it is an integrated system. You can start with the principles. They're in the center, which in much more simple language says, is it worth doing it? Are you doing it the best you possibly can? And are you making sure that any individual that's part of that process is being appropriately protected? Otherwise known as justification, optimization, and limitation. Those can be applied in different circumstances and situations. Things that are out there, they exist when you discover them, or they are legacies. There are things which you plan to do from the very beginning, and you can put all sorts of protection criteria before you ever let any radiation or radioactive material start to be used. And there are emergencies when something goes wrong, of course. To those, and in those, you have various categories of exposure. You have occupation exposure, public exposure, the unique category of medical exposure, but not just patients, but comforters and carers and other individuals, biomedical research and other things that all get wrapped into that issue. And now we look more and more towards the environmental considerations and environmental categories that need to be looked at as nodes in the process. You know, we've always lived in the environment. We just haven't done a very good job of actually explicitly showing how the material moves through the system and how it can be incorporated and built into the system of protection. If we come down to the other corner, you got dose criteria. And we've had lots of terms for dose criteria, enough that we've managed to really confuse ourselves and everyone else. We talk about reference levels. We talk about dose constraints. We talk about dose limits. We talk about diagnostic reference levels. We talk about derived consideration reference levels. And I could go on and on and on, all of which can fall into the generalized framework of values which are placed in an optimization process in order to ensure that there's some measure of equity across all the individuals that are being exposed, and to try and facilitate the process of optimization. And I will show that in just a moment. The last one, the requisites, something that perhaps you haven't so much considered as part of the framework, but in fact you find references to in a number of ICRP publications. If you haven't assessed the situation, you have no clue what's going on, you can't implement any of the framework. You have to know what's going on. You have to have some accountability. Someone has to be taking charge and looking to provide protection and interact with things. There has to be transparency. You have to provide the information, and you have to provide it in a way that whomever you're communicating with can actually understand what you're talking about. And again, over times, we've done that fairly well sometimes, and sometimes not quite so much. And something that has grown over the last decade and more, inclusiveness, stakeholder involvement, involving the people who have an interests in the various decisions and information and processes, giving them the opportunity to have the information, interact the information, provide that information to you. You would be absolutely amazed how much you can learn if you just stop and listen for a few minutes. So what is optimization? Optimization is the core of radiation protection. The object of the situation in most circumstances, and I leave medical as a unique bit there, is to try and move exposures towards lower values across the board. But in addition to that, to try and ensure that you do not have individuals, that nice little blue circle out there, that may be above a value which is really not where you would plan to be. Now, whether that is a constraint or a reference level and a planning value, which in and of itself is not a violation. Remember, I was a regulator for 33 years. Or whether you've decided to make that a very formal legal term, at which point the director of the Office of Enforcement of your local regulatory authority comes out and whacks you over the head. Okay, those are various legal formats, but all of those are directed to ensure that you are treating people justly and fairly and consistently across the whole process in an effort to try and move everyone towards as low as reasonably achievable. So the Committee 4 program of work. Committee 4 is the Committee on Applications. And we have an enormous scope of possibilities of work to do. In this term, we have 4 major areas in which we are conducting activities. The first is existing exposure situations, coming out of Publication 103 and the move to a situation-based activity. We recognized that while the system of protection grew up around planned situations, and that's a very nice little box and all of our language works very well in it, when you start to look at things that are already present in the environment, whether it is contamination from an event, whether it is material that you discover is there that wasn't done properly from some former activity, or whether it is high activity areas as a result of naturally occurring materials being used, or a whole variety of things. They're out there. They may need to be addressed. The second area is looking at response to the Fukushima Daiichi events. There was Task Group 84, which provided the Commission a whole series of recommendations of areas that ought to be examined to improve our framework. We are doing much of that work within the committee. We are looking at foundations. We are working on a series of topical and more focused reports. In addition to that, as an application group, we are trying to interact with all of the other committees to try and help provide that fundamental, practical application perspective to the work within the organization. And I will not try to read the slide. There are a whole variety of works that are underway. In the existing exposure situation, Publication 126 on radon, which was already mentioned, turn in the right direction here. John Harrison already told you a little bit about that, which came out in December of 2014. Today, on the website for public consultation is the report of Task Group 83, Protection from Cosmic Radiation in Aviation, an area where, in fact, if you look at the exposure distributions and you look at the average values that folks are getting who are pilots and aircrew, you find that they're higher than the average in the nuclear power plants. Certainly something that we felt we needed to start looking at and providing some advice on. We have ongoing efforts looking at naturally occurring radioactive material, which again is an enormous spread in and of itself. And we have work started looking at how to deal with contaminated sites. That work is a parallel work in close cooperation with the work that is ongoing that I'm going to talk about in a minute, looking again at living in contaminated lands. But let me step away just for a moment to talk about the fact that one of our objectives is to try and foster a unified approach to radiation protection, because existing exposure situations growing out of what used to be called interventions was perceived for a long time as a completely different thing, which in fact it is not. So some points here. Occupational exposure can in fact occur in essentially any exposure situation. My friend Shengli Nu from ILO is not here today, but the ILO would tell you that occupational exposure is anytime you're working. Well, that gets to be a wee bit cumbersome. So in the commission, we've defined that a little bit more tightly as also something that the employer, the licensee, would have some reasonable means of control and responsibility for. That still leaves an enormous scope, which is occupational exposure. As I mentioned before, you have to characterize the situation. It does you no good if you have no idea what your radiological circumstance is in. And that makes no difference whether something has just gone bang and you have no idea whether there is or isn't radioactive material, or if you are sending someone off to do industrial radiography and he rolls out the source and he doesn't realize that directly below him, the next floor down in the parking garage, is somebody walking back and forth. Or if you're in an airplane or any other situation that might occur. After you figure that out, you have to try and figure out if it is reasonable and appropriate to establish some controls. It may be that after you've assessed the situation, there's nothing that is really justified to do to improve the situation, but you have to make that decision. If you do that, then you manage the situation with optimization. You use the appropriate reference levels. You look to who are the individuals who may be getting the highest exposures and have some focus, but try to move optimization through. So optimization can always apply. You apply individual dose criteria that can be within, or if reasonable and appropriate, below the bands that are used. 1 to 20 in the existing plan is appropriate, 20 to 100 millisieverts in emergencies if necessary. That does not mean that if you're in an emergency, automatically that 100 millisieverts is acceptable. Well, if the prevailing circumstances that moment necessitates having individuals receive that in order to accomplish what's need to be done to recapture the situation and avoid getting things worse, then of course. But if it's not necessary, don't go assuming that you have to have a reference level at the upper portion of the band. The reference level should always be used to guide the situation, not just a happy number that is out there somewhere that does not challenge you to improve protection. You can then apply the basic requisites of accountability, transparency, interacting with the stakeholders. One of the things that we have discussed a lot is the question of, well, it's an existing situation. You can't use any of the tools that regulators love to use, because regulators and in fact licensees all love to use all sorts of tools. If you have things that are well characterized, you have all of the things that can be controlled in place, then it is not necessarily inappropriate to use the tools that are available in order to ensure that everything's worked properly. Let me quickly move on. The next major area is the response to Fukushima. Task Group 93 is a work that is in progress, updating both publications 109 on protecting people in the emergencies and 111, protecting people in long-term contaminated areas. This is a task group that has benefited greatly from much interaction and stakeholder involvement. A series of some 12 dialogue discussions in and around Fukushima with stakeholders, bringing in experiences from Chernobyl and otherwise to try and provide more practical advice based on that experience for how to work in these situations. That draft is going to be discussed in some detail in the coming days within Committee 4. The foundations of protection. And I get to the other major piece of work that we're addressing this week, Task Group 94 on ethics. Another group that has benefited enormously from a very unique and very excellent set of dialogues and workshops that we have done with IRPA. And I don't have even idea how many of those we have had to date, 7 or 8 at least, in a variety of places. There will be a session, the last session of this symposium will be focused on this topic, and so I'm not going to go into a lot of the details and let them do that. Again, we will be discussing in detail a draft here this week in Seoul. We intend to continue to be in a somewhat unique collaborative environment, and that the plan approved by the Commission is that we will have a draft for preliminary consultation for the special session that is planned at the IRPA Congress in Cape Town, South Africa, next May. That advice will be wrapped into a further refinement, which will then be on the website for a formal public consultation. So we're going to have multiple opportunities to continue to refine this and have people provide inputs to the discussion and process. Following that, I see almost certainly that there will be follow-on works of additional task groups to look at the applications of that ethical framework and context in various areas. One of the ones just begging for it is applications in the medical field. As a relationship to that, we have a working party that's looking at the tolerability of risk and a variety of other discussions on how this can all fit into applying the framework of protection. We are also developing a series of topical reports. The first one of these, security screening, which came out in August of last year, publication 125. A follow-on work to publication 122, which was on geologic waste repositories, is Task Group 97, which has been started looking at surface and near-surface disposal and radioactive materials. We have engaged formally and informally with the large number of organizations that have entered into a special relationship to look for other topical areas which would benefit from specific discussions on how to apply the framework. One that has come up several times, again in our interactions with the liaison organizations just yesterday, is high activity sources, particularly the mobile ones that go running around and get used in a different environment every single day, and for which the usual protections are not necessarily there because you don't have wonderful shielded walls and interlocked doors and all of the other sorts of things. But there are others. So we're going to be looking at some of those and other topics that have been suggested. So to wrap up this very rapid tour de force of the committee, Committee 4 has 17 members from some 14 different countries, 4 major areas of ongoing work at this time, 6 active task groups and a variety of other activities, and we are starting to challenge ourselves already for where to take the next steps in terms of the evolution of the system of protection. Thank you very much.